For years, Frank Fritz was a familiar presence in millions of living rooms, quiet, observant, and deeply human. He wasn't the loudest voice on the road, but he was the one who made the journey feel real. Behind his smile was a man carrying pain that never fully made it on screen. And in the final years of his life, that pain grew heavier than anyone expected. This is the story of Frank Fritz, not the version people remember, but the one who slowly disappeared when the cameras stopped rolling. Before American Pickers became a long-running television success, it was simply two men driving across America with a shared obsession for history. From the very beginning, Frank Fritz was never positioned as the star. He didn't push conversations. He didn't dominate negotiations. Instead, he grounded them. While Mike Wolfe chased leads with speed and confidence, Frank moved carefully, listening more than he spoke, letting sellers talk themselves into revealing what really mattered. Viewers connected with Frank because he felt authentic. He wasn't performing enthusiasm, he was living it. His passion leaned toward antique toys, oil cans, and objects tied to childhood and memory rather than profit. Those choices gave the show emotional weight. Every item Frank picked up came with a story, and he treated those stories with respect. As the show grew after its debut, the workload intensified. Travel schedules became relentless. Filming days stretched longer. What once felt like a road trip between friends gradually transformed into a demanding production cycle. Frank kept going, even as his health quietly declined. For years, he managed Crohn's disease, an unpredictable condition that had followed him for more than 3 decades. Some days were manageable, others were exhausting, but Frank rarely spoke publicly about the toll it took. On screen, nothing appeared broken. The chemistry remained. The banter continued. But behind the scenes, pressure was building. Frank later admitted that the pace of the show was wearing him down physically and mentally. The lifestyle that once felt freeing had become punishing. Despite this, Frank stayed loyal to the show and to the partnership that built it. He believed the road would always bring them back together, that stepping away briefly would not mean being left behind. At that point, he still believed American Pickers was about friendship first, television second. He didn't yet realize that this balance, the very thing that made the show special, was already starting to slip away. By the time Frank Fritz stepped away from American Pickers, his decision wasn't driven by burnout or ambition. It was driven by pain. Years of physical strain had finally caught up with him, and what he initially dismissed as chronic discomfort had turned into something far more dangerous. When doctors examined his condition, the diagnosis was blunt. His spine was close to splitting. Continuing without surgery was no longer an option. The operation that followed was severe. Surgeons placed 2 rods down the center of his spine and closed the incision with 185 stitches. Recovery was slow and punishing. Frank was no longer traveling, no longer filming, and no longer living the routine that had defined his adult life. For the first time in years, he was forced to sit still and confront the reality of his health. At the same time, Crohn's disease continued to complicate everything. Frank had lived with it for more than 30 years, describing it as unpredictable and unforgiving. Some days he could function normally. Other days, simple food choices triggered intense flare-ups. There was no cure, no consistent pattern, and no way to plan around it. Managing Crohn's while recovering from major spinal surgery pushed his body to its limits. Frank believed the absence from the show would be temporary. He expected time to heal, followed by a return to the road. But as weeks turned into months, the communication he expected never came. He later said the network stopped contacting him altogether. Even a promised follow-up call from the showrunner never happened. The silence felt deliberate. This period also marked a turning point in Frank's personal life. He entered rehab and committed himself to sobriety, eventually reaching nearly a year without alcohol. Losing close family members to alcohol-related illness had forced him to confront where his own habits could lead. He wanted to rebuild, to come back healthier, both physically and mentally. Instead, Frank found himself isolated, away from the show, away from the routine, and increasingly unsure whether there was still a place for him. The road he thought he had temporarily stepped off began to feel like one he had been quietly pushed away from. And with that realization, the foundation of everything Frank believed about his future began to crack. What hurt Frank Fritz most was not the surgery, the pain, or even the uncertainty of his future on American Pickers. It was the silence. After nearly a decade of working side by side, Frank expected at least a call from Mike Wolfe during his recovery. It never came. According to Frank, Mike knew how serious the surgery was, yet never reached out to ask how he was doing. That absence cut deeper than any professional setback. In a candid interview, Frank admitted he and Mike had not spoken for nearly 2 years. The friendship that once defined the show had dissolved quietly, without a clear ending. Frank felt abandoned, not just as a co-host, but as a person. He described feeling pushed aside long before his exit, sensing that the show had gradually become centered around Mike alone. Frank compared the dynamic to being in a band where one member becomes the face while the others fade into the background. He said he had accepted being second, but what he couldn't accept was being treated as disposable. From his perspective, the balance that once existed was gone. Mike Wolfe eventually addressed Frank's absence publicly, posting a message that acknowledged their long history and wished him well. But Frank rejected the statement, calling it insincere and claiming it didn't reflect how Mike treated him privately. He believed the message was written for appearance, not reconciliation. The situation worsened when addiction entered the conversation. Mike later suggested that Frank's personal struggles were part of the reason he couldn't return to the show. Frank strongly disagreed. He said he was sober and actively trying to rebuild his life. 2 versions of the truth circulated, each fueling public speculation and deepening the divide. For fans, the fallout was painful to watch. The easy chemistry that once felt unbreakable was now replaced by interviews, headlines, and indirect statements. There was no clear villain, only 2 men carrying unresolved resentment and disappointment. As American Pickers continued without Frank, the absence became impossible to ignore. Viewers noticed the shift immediately. The road was still there, the antiques were still there, but the quiet presence that once made the journey feel complete was gone. And for Frank, the loss of that connection marked the beginning of a much darker chapter. One where his health and his sense of belonging would both begin to fail him at the same time. In the summer of 2022, Frank Fritz's life changed in a matter of hours. After years of health struggles that had already taken him off the road, he suffered a massive stroke that left doctors uncertain about his survival. The damage was severe. When Frank regained consciousness, the right side of his body was largely paralyzed. Simple movements that once came naturally were suddenly impossible without assistance. The stroke was not an isolated event. It was the result of long-term cerebral vascular disease, compounded by years of physical stress and chronic illness. Frank was hospitalized immediately, and the recovery process was slow, uncertain, and exhausting. He could no longer live independently. What little control he had managed to maintain over his life slipped away almost overnight. As Frank focused on survival, the world he had built began to collapse around him. His antique shop, located hundreds of miles from where he was receiving treatment, fell into serious decline. Without his daily presence, the business deteriorated. Sales dropped dramatically. The once welcoming space grew neglected, reflecting the absence of the man who gave it purpose. Friends soon realized that Frank could no longer manage his personal or financial affairs. Emergency guardianship and conservatorship were established to protect him. While the decision was necessary, it marked a painful turning point. Frank, who had spent his life searching for forgotten pieces of history, had now become dependent on others to manage his own. Despite everything, Frank tried to stay connected to the world he loved. Even under conservatorship, he remained involved in pricing items and making decisions about his shop when possible. It was one of the few ways he could still feel like himself. Public reaction was immediate and emotional. Fans who had followed Frank for years were shocked by the news. Many feared they would never see him again. In response, Mike Wolfe broke his silence, asking people to pray for Frank instead of revisiting old conflicts. The message was clear. Whatever had gone wrong between them no longer mattered. For the first time in years, the focus shifted away from arguments and explanations. It shifted to something far more fragile, whether Frank Fritz would survive at all. By the time Frank Fritz entered long-term assisted care, it was clear that recovery would not mean returning to the life he once knew. He relied on a wheelchair and required constant supervision. Daily routines became medical schedules. Physical therapy sessions were exhausting, and progress was limited. Each small improvement came with setbacks that reminded everyone how fragile his condition had become. Frank's health complications continued to multiply. In addition to the damage caused by the stroke, he suffered from aortic stenosis, which restricted blood flow through his heart, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which made breathing increasingly difficult. These conditions placed constant strain on his body, making even minor illnesses dangerous. Eventually, Frank was moved into hospice care, signaling that treatment had shifted from recovery to comfort. During this period, something unexpected happened. In 2023, nearly 3 years after their last in-person contact, Frank and Mike Wolfe finally reunited. The meeting was not arranged for cameras or publicity, it was personal. Frank had requested to see Mike, and when the two men came face to face, emotions surfaced immediately. According to those present, both were in tears. They talked about the early days, the uncertain beginnings, the long drives with no destination, the pressure of suddenly being watched by millions. Mike told Frank something fans had always believed, but Frank had long needed to hear. No one could replace him. For Frank, those words mattered. They acknowledged what had been lost, even if they couldn't restore it. The reunion offered a sense of peace, but it could not reverse the damage already done. Frank's health continued to decline throughout the following months. He remained largely bedridden, his mobility further reduced, his strength fading. Friends visited when possible, but his world had grown very small. While American pickers continued filming without him and entered new seasons, Frank's connection to the show existed only in memory. The road trips were over. The van was gone. What remained were fragments of a life defined by movement, now confined to stillness. The reconciliation brought emotional closure, but it also underscored a painful truth. The bond that defined an era of television had been repaired only when time was already running out. In the final months of his life, Frank Fritz was no longer fighting to recover. He was fighting to endure. Confined to hospice care, his days were structured around comfort rather than treatment. The stroke he had suffered years earlier never released its hold. Medical records later confirmed that the damage to his brain continued to progress, a condition known as late sequela of cerebral infarction, a slow, irreversible consequence of the original stroke. Frank's body was under constant strain. Cerebral vascular disease had compromised blood flow to his brain. Aortic stenosis restricted circulation through his heart. COPD weakened his lungs, making each breath more laborious than the last. Individually, each condition was serious. Together, they overwhelmed a body that had already endured decades of illness. Despite his condition, Frank was not alone at the end. Mike Wolfe was with him in his final moments. It was a quiet ending, far removed from highways, barns, and long conversations in a white cargo van. When Frank passed away on September 30th at the age of 60, the journey that had defined his life came to a stop. The following day, Mike shared the news publicly. His words were not defensive or rehearsed. They were reflective. He spoke of Frank as a dreamer, someone who was just as sensitive as he was funny, someone who never changed for the cameras. He remembered the years before fame, when they traveled without plans, driven only by curiosity and a shared love for history. He said he felt blessed to be by Frank's side when he took his final journey home. Others echoed that sentiment. Frank was described as the heart and anchor of American pickers, not because he spoke the loudest, but because he made the show feel honest. His presence reminded viewers that the value of an object came from the people who once loved it. The show continues into new seasons, but Frank's absence is permanent. What he left behind cannot be replaced by format changes or new faces. He left behind a sense of authenticity that television rarely allows anymore. Frank Fritz's story did not end in triumph. It ended in truth. And sometimes, that is the most powerful ending of all. Do you think Frank Fritz was truly appreciated while he was still here? Share your thoughts and memories in the comments below. If you value stories that go beyond the surface, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real stories behind television legends.